So far we've discussed the problems that come with independent clauses. Now it's time to talk about what can happen when you don't even have an independent clause in a sentence at all. And when that's the case, you have what's called a fragment. Now, this may be something you've been marked off on essays in school, and if you never really knew what the teacher meant, if they wrote something like fragment or frag, cryptically like that, this video will help explain. So like I said, a fragment is when you don't have an independent clause, aka you don't have a subject-verb relationship in the sentence or a finite verb in the sentence. Now you could have verbals, that is, you could have words that look like verbs and are kind of forms of verbs, but that doesn't mean you're going to have a complete sentence if you don't have this subject-verb relationship or this finite verb. So what are some examples? Well, there are a lot of examples, but here is one particular one that comes up a lot. Let's see. So a lot of times they're started off with a prepositional phrase. So something like this. In Japan, during the war. So actually these are two prepositional phrases. There's not even a verbal in here. If this were written in as a sentence, it's not really a sentence, this would be a fragment, right? Because there's no verb relationship. This is actually just two prepositional phrases stacked on top of each other. So if this were written in an essay, we'd have to open it up and add an independent clause or something. Add some finite verb, subject-verb relationship to flesh it out. Sometimes it's with prepositional phrases. So another example would be after school. Nah, that's not a good example. Let me just move past the prepositional phrases and on to where you have, say, participles starting the sentence. So something like this. Working through the night on her project. If this were written as a sentence, this is not a complete sentence. It's a fragment, again. Why? Because, again, we may have a verbal. We have working, which in this case is, well, I guess it's a gerund. I mean, it depends on how it's being used. In this case, I guess it's a gerund because it's acting as a noun. And we'll talk about gerunds, participles, and infinitives in a later video. But the point is this is not even a finite verb. We can say that for sure, right? There's no subject that goes with this. Working is not going to be a properly conjugated verb. So therefore, this is not an independent clause and doesn't have an independent clause. In fact, we're waiting, this sentence is waiting for something else to complete the thought, right? This is setting the stage for the sentence, but it's not really completing it. You could also start with regular nouns. So some people stealing fish. I don't know. Right here would be an example of another fragment, because some people and stealing, sure, it's a verbal, and you might say this is a subject, or at least it's a noun. But the problem is this is not the properly conjugated version of steal. If you did some people steal fish, that would be independent clause. But as written, this as well is a fragment. So as you can see, these fragments are usually going to be caused either by some sort of participle, so working, or the past participle like worked, or gerunds, or even infinitives, really any other version of the verb besides the actual conjugated form. Let me see if I can come up with any other examples that might... Okay, so sometimes you can actually have a conjugated verb and a subject, but because you've begun that sentence with a subordinate clause or subordinate conjunction, which we'll talk about when we go over subordinate clauses, you're made it into a fragment. So an example would be this. Even though he had won the game. Let's actually get rid of the had. Even though he won the game. So here we got a subject, right? And a verb. So this is a clause. But the problem is this is a dependent clause or subordinate clause, right? Because you have this even though, right? Even though he won the game, comma, blah, 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 blah. We're waiting for the independent clause to complete the thought. So actually sometimes you can have clauses. Like these here are not clauses, right? They don't even have a verb, a finite verb at all. So these are phrases. And they're still fragments, but they're phrases. This is a clause. It's a dependent clause, but if it were written like this with nothing else to complete it, it would be a fragment. So on the SAT, well, two things to finish up the video. Number one, So, like I mentioned in many other videos, SAT grammar, SAT style, and kind of real life, real world grammar and style are often two different things. And this is one example. Sometimes when you read certain kinds of fiction, or even maybe even a little more formal writing than that, you will see people use fragments because they are used stylistically. So you can imagine some of these fragments here could be used as sentences in prose if you wanted to make some kind of stylistic, move or make some sort of point or something, right? So they're kind of grammatically illegal but stylistically legal. So don't think that fragments are always wrong and you should never use them, because if you're writing in a particular style, you don't want to use them. In general, though, you want to avoid fragments. I mean, that's 99% of the time you don't want to use fragments. For the SAT, they're not going to have fragments as blatant as these. You're generally going to have longer sentences, and this is mostly for the improving sentences. You're going to have longer sentences with more working parts, but you're always going to want to look for, though, how do you detect a fragment? Is you always want to look for, first, is there a subject-verb relationship? These three did not even have that, so that tells you it's a fragment. And if it does have a subject-verb relationship, you want to make sure that that subject and verb is not subordinated to something else. Like in this case, we had a subject and a verb, but we have even though, which implies, given this is a subordinate conjunction, that this is going to be a subordinate clause to something else. So we're going to talk more. We'll get more information on this as well in the participles, gerunds, and infinitives video. But I think this should be enough to at least give you the basics to help sort out sentence structure for the SAT.